The first time I understood what money really was, I was not looking at a stock chart. I was looking at a man with a large income and almost no freedom. From a distance, he looked successful. The house was in the right neighborhood. The cars were new enough to signal progress. The schools were good. The vacations photographed well. The social circle approved. The title sounded important. The salary was the kind that makes other people assume the game has already been won. But if you looked at the structure underneath the appearance, you found something entirely different. You found dependence. You found a life so full of fixed costs that one interruption could have turned confidence into panic. You found a man who needed the next paycheck, then the next one after that, then the next one after that, because he had quietly built a system that consumed nearly everything his labor produced. He had not built wealth. He had built a lifestyle with expensive handcuffs. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in personal finance. Most people think money is about consumption. They think it is about what can be bought, displayed, upgraded, replaced, or enjoyed. That is the public version of money. It is the shallow version. The useful version is different. Money is not primarily about buying more things. Money is about buying back your time. That is the first truth I would want a person to understand if he came to me confused, discouraged, or secretly ashamed about his finances. Because once you understand that money is a time, the entire game changes. The same dollar starts looking different. The same expense starts feeling heavier. The same savings decision starts carrying a kind of dignity that flashy spending never had. I have watched thousands of people damage their financial future, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they misunderstood the function of capital. They treated money emotionally when they should have treated it mathematically. They measured wealth using social comparison instead of structural freedom. They assumed high income was the same thing as strength. It is not. High income without optionality is simply a faster treadmill. That is why I want to talk about one number, $100,000. Not because that number is sacred. Not because it makes you rich. Not because crossing it solves every problem. It does not. But it represents something very important. It is one of the first real thresholds where capital starts behaving differently. Below it, your money often feels like a helper. Above it, if handled correctly, your money begins to feel like a system. And most people hear that and immediately make one of two mistakes. They either think $100,000 is trivial, which usually means they have never been forced to build it slowly and defend it carefully, or they think $100,000 is impossibly far away, which usually means they are still trapped inside the wrong equations. I want to correct both misunderstandings. Let me begin with the most common error I see. People confuse income with wealth. This destroys more lives than market crashes do. A person earning $300,000 a year may look rich. Sometimes he is rich. Often he is merely expensive. That difference is brutal because expensive people are fragile in ways poor people often understand better than they do. A poor person usually knows he is financially vulnerable. The expensive high earner often does not. He mistakes flow for foundation. He mistakes a large paycheck for a strong structure. Then one day the paycheck stumbles and he discovers he was never standing on capital. He was standing on velocity. I once studied two financial lives side by side because I wanted to explain this to someone in a way that could not be argued away. The first man earned around $300,000 a year. Very respectable. He lived where successful people live because success, in his world, had to be visible. He drove a car that told the world he was doing well. The house payment was large, property taxes were large, insurance was large. The second vehicle, private school, travel habits, social expectations, and invisible lifestyle obligations all added up before the year. Even properly started, his life had already claimed most of the money he would earn. On paper, he looked powerful. In practice, he had almost no room. The second man earned around $80,000 a year, not poor, not luxurious, just solid, ordinary income. But he lived in a simpler place, drove an older car he owned outright, kept his fixed costs modest, and never let social comparison dictate his recurring expenses. His life was not glamorous enough to impress the wrong people, but it had a quality the first man's life lacked: slack margin, breathing room when you ran the numbers honestly. The lower earner was often in the stronger position. He could save more proportionally. He could survive disruption better. He could wait for opportunities. He could say no. He could reach 100,000 in real capital years earlier because he was not trying to fund an identity every month. This is one of the great hidden laws of finance. The person with lower status pressure and lower recurring costs often has far more actual power than the person with a larger salary and a more demanding life structure. That is because optionality beats appearance every time. The market does not care what your neighbors think of your car. Freedom cares very much what your recurring. Once you understand that, the standard advice to just earn more starts sounding incomplete. Earning more is useful. Very useful. I believe strongly in improving earning power. But income alone is only half the machine. The other half is whether your life has become efficient enough to convert income into capital. A lot of people never make that conversion. They get a raise and the raise disappears into the upgraded apartment, the upgraded car, the upgraded habits, the upgraded memberships, the upgraded restaurants, and the upgraded expectations. The income rises. The structure does not improve. They are wealthier only in the eyes of strangers, and strangers are very expensive people to impress. The reason this matters so much is because capital does not behave linearly. This is the second great misunderstanding. People think money scales in straight lines because labor usually does. Work one more hour, get paid one more hour, put in more visible effort, earn more visible compensation. The world of wages teaches people to think linearly. Capital teaches something else. Capital teaches thresholds. If you have $10,000 invested at 8%, you earn $800 a year. Nice. Useful, but not life-changing. It does not yet alter your decision space in a meaningful way. If you have $100,000 invested at that same rate, now you are talking about $8,000 a year. That is not retirement. It is not financial independence, but it is no longer trivial. It starts paying a bill. It starts covering insurance. It starts creating room. More importantly, it marks the point where your capital is no longer symbolic. It is doing real work that changes the psychology. A person with $10,000 invested still feels mostly dependent on labor. A person with $100,000 begins to feel the presence of a second worker in the room, a quiet worker, a patient worker, but a worker nonetheless. And once that second worker exists, the curve changes. This is the part compounding books tell you in elegant charts, and almost nobody explains honestly in emotional terms. The first phase feels brutally slow. If you save $20,000 a year, getting from 0 to 100,000 may take roughly 4.5 to 5 years, depending on return assumptions. That can feel long because your contributions are doing almost all of the heavy lifting. You are the engine. The portfolio is mostly a passenger. But once the first 100 is there, the next 100 arrives faster. Now your savings and your capital are pushing in the same direction. Then the next stage gets faster still. That is the nonlinear return curve. Not exciting at the beginning, very powerful later. That is why 100,000 matters so much. Not because it is enough, because it is where many people first begin crossing from accumulation into actual compounding. And yet this is exactly where they make the dumbest mistake of all. They reach the threshold and immediately start fantasizing about what it can buy. That is the fatal misunderstanding. They think the 100,000 is available. It is not available. It is equipment. It is the first real piece of machinery in the Freedom Factory. You would not buy a small business, install productive equipment, and then tear the equipment out to pay for a nicer vacation because seeing the machines made you feel successful. That would be insane. Yet people do exactly that with financial capital. They build 100,000 and then start talking themselves into rewarding the effort by weakening the structure that effort built. A luxury car, A lifestyle expansion meant to prove that the hard work amounted to something visible. No, the whole point of the 100,000 is not what it buys directly. The whole point is what it allows the future to stop demanding from you. That is why I tell people to think of the first serious capital base as a manufacturing plant. Not as spare cash. Not as celebration money, a plant. It sits there and quietly produces output if you leave it intact. The minute you start treating the plant like a piggy bank, you reset the whole game. And that reset is more expensive than people realize, because you do not only lose the money removed, you lose the years of compounding that money would have produced. This is where opportunity cost becomes more than a textbook phrase. Suppose someone wants to spend $5,000 on a luxury vacation. Fine. But the honest question is not merely whether the vacation costs $5,000. The honest question is what else those $5,000 could have become inside the freedom system. At 8%, $5,000 grows into a surprisingly large sum over 30 years. But the long-term figure, while useful, is not even the most immediate point. $5,000 today is not just future wealth. It is current optionality. It is part of the base-generating monthly return. It is part of the structure that makes job loss less frightening, market downturns less personal, and bad timing less catastrophic. That is how I want people to think. Not what does this cost today? What future flexibility am I surrendering if I use the money this way instead of putting it to work? You cannot answer every spending decision with austerity. Life would become ridiculous. Some spending is worth it. Some pleasure matters. Some experiences absolutely belong in a well-lived life. But if you are serious about financial freedom, you have to start evaluating choices not only by immediate pleasure, but by how they affect the optionality of your future. That is adult capital allocation. And adult capital allocation begins with a question few people ever ask. Honestly, what am I optimizing for? That may be the most important question in the whole discussion, because many people say they want freedom while their actual decisions reveal they are optimizing for normality. Normal consumption, normal image management, normal comfort, normal monthly spending patterns, normal admiration from people who are often just as financially trapped. Normal is extremely expensive. Normal is why so many people work until 65 or 70 and still feel uneasy. Normal is why high earners stay dependent. Normal is why people with strong salaries and weak balance sheets cannot sleep when the company starts restructuring. I have no interest in normal, when normal means dependence with better branding. I am interested in sovereignty. If you are optimizing for sovereignty, everything changes. You stop treating every dollar as permission. You start treating money as soldiers that can either die in the field of consumption or be recruited into the army that buys back your time. That sounds dramatic. Good. The subject deserves some seriousness, because what money really buys above the level of basic needs is not status. It buys time sovereignty. It buys the ability to say no. It buys the ability to survive a bad boss without instantly losing your nerve. It buys the ability to wait for the right opportunity instead of grabbing the first available one in fear. It buys the ability to help family from strength rather than from self-harm. It buys the ability to pursue meaningful work instead of work that merely funds a life you do not even fully enjoy. That is what freedom means in mathematics. Not yachts, not applause. Control over your own time. The cleanest way I know to make this practical is through what I think of as a freedom number. People complicate financial planning because complication is profitable to the people selling it. I prefer cleaner math. Your freedom number is the capital required to fund your annual expenses through conservative returns. If you can live on $40,000 a year and you assume a 4% sustainable withdrawal rate after inflation, then your freedom number is around $1 million. If you need $60,000, your freedom number is roughly $1.5 million. If you only need $30,000, then your freedom number is around $750,000. That is the part most people ignore. They obsess over how to make more money while failing to realize that every reduction in annual required expenses reduces the capital needed for independence proportionally. This is one of the most powerful levers in finance because it is so direct. You may or may not be able to double your income quickly. You can absolutely examine your fixed costs. You can downsize. You can refuse the expensive car. You can reject the big house identity trap. You can reduce subscriptions, habits, convenience spending, and recurring obligations. You can restructure your life. That action lowers the size of the machine required to set you free. This is why I often say the shortest route to freedom is not always through earning more. Sometimes it is through needing less. Not because deprivation is noble, because efficiency is powerful. And there is an additional beauty to this that people miss. Reducing your expense structure does not only lower your freedom number later, it increases your savings rate now. That is a double win. If you lower expenses by $10,000 a year, you have not only reduced the annual spending your future portfolio must support, you have also created $10,000 in current cash flow that can be directed toward building the portfolio in the first place. That sort of two-sided leverage is extraordinarily valuable. Yet most people ignore it because spending cuts feel less glamorous than salary increases. I understand why. A raise feels like expansion. Expense reduction feels like restraint. But finance does not award points for emotional framing. It rewards the math. And the math is often kinder to the person who can redesign his lifestyle than to the person who only chases more income without fixing the architecture of consumption. There is another truth here that deserves attention. The human brain adapts very quickly to upgrades. A luxury becomes normal faster than people expect. You get the nicer apartment, and within months it feels like the minimum decent standard. You get the expensive car, and soon it no longer feels like a treat. It feels like what someone like you drives. That is how lifestyle inflation becomes invisible. It does not announce itself as a permanent claim on your freedom. It arrives dressed as deserved progress, and because it feels justified, people do not resist it. This is not a moral failing. It is neural adaptation. The brain is built to normalize what is repeated. That is why you cannot simply trust your feelings after an upgrade. Your feelings will often tell you the new baseline is reasonable, even if the mathematics say it is costly. So if I were advising someone serious about reaching 100,000, I would tell him to become suspicious of recurring upgrades. Not because all improvement is bad, because repeated upgrades quietly turn optionality into obligation. And obligation is the enemy of freedom. The moment you understand that, a strange thing happens. A modest apartment stops looking like evidence of failure and starts looking like a strategic base. An older paid-off car stops looking embarrassing and starts looking elegant. Cooking at home stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like retained capital. Declining a status purchase stops feeling like missing out and starts feeling like self-respect. This is the psychological shift the culture does not want to teach, because a culture organized around consumption depends on people never reaching it. Once you see money as time stored in financial form, you stop donating it casually to things that do not justify the exchange. That brings us to behavior. People often think discipline is the solution. It is not. Discipline matters. Yes, but willpower is a poor operating system for a long project. It is finite, it tires, it argues, it disappears under stress. The people who build real wealth usually do not rely mainly on heroic daily restraint. They rely on systems. That is why I prefer automatic structures. If I want to build freedom, I do not wait to see what is left at the end of the month. There is rarely much left at the end of a month designed around easy spending. I move the money first. I would route a meaningful portion of income directly into investment accounts before it has a chance to look available for anything else. This is what I think of as paying the freedom system first, not last. First, when money lands, part of it belongs immediately to the future. Not because I feel inspired, because I decided that in advance when I was calm, Automation is beautiful because it removes debate. No monthly courtroom in your head. No exhausting question of whether this is a good month to save. No illusion that you will be more disciplined after the holidays, after the bonus, after the trip, after the stress at work passes. The transfer happens. That is what good systems do. They protect the future from temporary versions of yourself. If a person is serious and early in the wealth-building stage, I would want a substantial percentage of income heading toward that system. 20% should be considered ordinary seriousness. 30 or 40% changes the timeline dramatically. 50%, while not available to everyone, is not fantasy for those who align income with a modest cost structure. That sounds aggressive to people trained to optimize for immediate comfort. From the standpoint of freedom mathematics, it is often very reasonable. Because every extra dollar directed into capital is not only a saved dollar, it is a purchased piece of future time. And time, in the end, is what almost everyone wants when they say they want money. There is another layer here that matters greatly. Comparison. Human beings are social animals. They read status signals constantly. They notice what others drive, where they live, what they post, what they seem to enjoy, how relaxed they appear, how much they spend. This comparison mechanism is ancient and powerful, and in modern consumer culture it becomes financially destructive very quickly. If everyone around you is spending, then restraint feels like self-punishment. If your information environment is full of luxury, then modesty feels like falling behind. If your peers upgrade whenever income rises, then staying efficient feels like a social demotion. This is why environment matters so much. A person can have sound financial logic and still be slowly dragged toward bad behavior by constant exposure to consumption theater. That is why I would clean up the information environment just as deliberately as I would clean up the bank account. Less lifestyle content, less status signaling, less admiration for visible spending. More contact with people who value autonomy, flexibility, calm, and actual capital. This is not about becoming antisocial. It is about protecting the internal compass from being magnetized by the wrong field. Once comparison weakens, decision quality often improves almost immediately. You stop asking what people like me are supposed to buy. You start asking what someone building freedom would do. That question is much better. Now let us return to 100, because this threshold is where the psychological and mathematical stories finally meet. If someone reaches that number and understands what it is, his relationship with life changes. He still works perhaps, he still plans, he still builds, but the background fear begins to weaken. There is capital now, there is a machine now. There is proof that the process works. This matters more than outsiders realize. The first 100 is not only a financial milestone, it is evidence. Evidence that you can direct money instead of merely receiving and spending it. Evidence that the future can be built deliberately rather than hoped for vaguely. Evidence that your decisions can create a second source of power besides labor. That evidence changes posture. It changes negotiation. It changes how risk feels. Once a person has 100,000 and a sane expense structure, he can begin taking risks from strength rather than desperation. He can invest selectively in a skill. He can fund a small business experiment. He can take a temporary career detour if it leads somewhere valuable. He can endure a market correction with less panic because he knows he owns both time and reserves. This is what I mean when I say capital creates optionality. Optionality is one of the least appreciated luxuries in the world. It means the ability to choose rather than merely react. The broke person reacts. The high earner with no margin reacts. The heavily obligated household reacts. The person with capital and modest fixed cost chooses. That is an entirely different life. People often object here and say this all sounds too severe. What about enjoying life now? What about youth? What about the risk that the future never comes? I understand the emotional force of that argument. It is partly true. Life should be lived. Pleasure matters. Relationships matter. Experiences matter. But there is a lazy version of that argument that gets used to excuse all sorts of wasteful behavior. It pretends every act of restraint is joyless and every act of spending is life-affirming. That is, childish research on happiness has shown for a long time that beyond a certain level of basic financial security, more consumption yields less and less additional satisfaction. The early money matters: food, safety, health care, decent housing, room to breathe. Very important. Beyond that, the curve flattens. More status spending does not deliver proportionate happiness. What does deliver durable well-being is much closer to what capital buys: indirectly, lower stress, more control, less fear, more autonomy, more flexibility. So no, I do not believe the path to freedom is a tragic life of endless denial. I believe it is a life of strategic prioritization. Spend where life is genuinely enriched. Cut hard where the spending exists mainly to preserve appearances, convenience addiction, or identity theater. That is not extremism. It is mature capital allocation. And mature capital allocation is what gets a person to the point where his money starts working hard enough to change his life. Here is another important truth. The timeline is often shorter than people think if they stop lying to themselves about their savings rate. If you save $10,000 a year and invest intelligently, the path to $100,000 may be around 8 years, depending on returns. At $20,000 a year, the timeline drops dramatically. At $30,000, shorter still. These are not fantasy numbers for people with middle-class incomes and sound expense discipline. They are hard, yes, they require intention, yes, but they are not outlandish. What usually makes them feel outlandish is not mathematics. It is normal spending patterns. Change the spending patterns and suddenly the impossible becomes operational. That is the power of focusing on the variable you actually control. You cannot reliably control market returns. You cannot force income growth on command. You cannot eliminate every uncertainty. You can absolutely control how much of your current inflow gets converted into future freedom. That is the lever. And pulling the lever repeatedly produces a kind of momentum that is valuable in itself. Progress reinforces behavior. The account grows. The machine becomes. You begin seeing the future not as a vague hope, but as a structure you are actually building. That is one of the most satisfying feelings in finance, not excitement. Traction. I trust traction much more than excitement. Excitement leads people into bad trades, big purchases, and short-lived plans. Traction builds wealth. So if I were talking to someone sitting with this idea for the first time, I would say this: $100,000 is not the finish line. It is the first serious platform. It is where your relationship with money changes from purely linear labor exchange into something more interesting. It is where the first meaningful layer of optionality appears. It is where the compounding machine becomes worth defending as a system rather than treating as a pile of available cash. To get there, you do not need genius. You need clarity. You need to stop confusing income with wealth. You need to stop measuring yourself against other people's visible spending. You need to optimize for freedom rather than normality. You need to cut the recurring costs that make your life dependent on constant income. You need to automate the flow into capital. You need to protect the threshold once you reach it. And perhaps above all, you need to understand what money actually is: stored time, stored choice, stored flexibility, stored future calm. That is why the first serious capital matters so much. Not because it buys more things, because it starts buying you back from the marketplace. And that, to me, is the most honorable and useful purpose money can serve. If I had to reduce the entire lesson to one line, I would say this: a person with $100,000 and low fixed costs is often far richer in the ways that matter than a person making 3 times as much and chained to a life he cannot afford to lose. That is not motivational language. That is structural truth. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, your financial decisions start changing. You stop asking what feels normal. You start asking what increases freedom. You stop asking what makes you look successful. You start asking what makes you harder to control. You stop asking what you can buy with money. You start asking what money can stop forcing you to do. That is when wealth really begins. Not at 1 million, not at some social benchmark. At the moment, your money stops being a servant of consumption and begins becoming an architect of sovereignty. That is the life $100,000 can begin. And if you build correctly from there, the next thresholds arrive faster. The choices widen, the fear softens, and the whole structure of your life becomes more your own. That is why I care about the number. Not because it is enough, because it changes the way enough eventually becomes possible.